Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's discussion. Wonderful to see so many people here tonight to hear our keynote speaker. Highline New York, a lecture by its founder, Robert Hammond, Any Lessons for Melbourne, and we hope there are. This evening's lecture is brought to you by Melbourne Conversations, the City of Melbourne's program of free public talks, and also Melbourne Knowledge Week. My name's Rob Gell. It's my pleasure to be your host this evening. Like you, I'm very much looking forward to Robert Hammond's presentation. Promotion of this evening's lecture and discussion has been kindly supported by future leaders. Now, many of you will have heard Robert Hammond being interviewed in the media over the last few days. And I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that the Highline project has really captured the imagination of many Melburnians and Victorians, in fact probably many Australians who were previously unaware of the project. The concept of taking a disused railway line which ran through New York City, and making it the most popular park in that city is quite a remarkable story. I'll leave it to Robert to introduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Robert Hammond.
Whoops. Thank you all for coming. It's so exciting to see so many people. It always sort of still surprises me that this many people care about the Highline. So how many people have been to the Highline? Wow, that's a lot. So I think what I'm going to do is give a little bit of a history of the line and then talk about sort of how we turn this sort of crazy dream into reality and talk about some of the issues that we have going on right now. So the trains used to run down 10th Avenue in the middle of Manhattan, and this is a photo of what it looked like, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the train that the railroad hired a guy on horseback to run in front of the trains, and he became known as the West Side Cowboy. But he wasn't a very good cowboy because about one person was still killed every month. So they elevated the train tracks. And this was always a freight train. It was never a passenger train or a subway or a tramway. It was bringing goods into the west side of Manhattan, which was mostly manufacturing. It gained the nickname Lifeline of New York because it brought in a lot of food, and a lot of the warehouses were refrigerated warehouses where it would store milk and eggs and butter. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And in 1980, the last train rode. It was the story goes, it was a train load of frozen turkeys at Thanksgiving. That's what we eat at Thanksgiving. And actually, this is how I first came in touch with the Highline, was this photograph. There was a bar that I used to go to that was across the street from this building. And this part of the Highline had actually already been torn down, but they had this photo in the bar. And I just thought it was so cool that a train ran through my neighborhood. But I didn't honestly give it much thought. This is what I saw, what was left of the Highline. And this photo doesn't do justice to the rust. It was basically sort of this rusting hulk. But I still, to me it was very romantic. It was like sort of a Roman aqueduct, except an industrial version, and not really even that old. I often have to remind myself the Highline is the same age as my father. So, again, this is what I saw. And then I read an article in the newspaper in 1999 that it was going to be demolished. And in that article, they had a little map, and they showed that the whole thing was about 1.5 miles long, so 2 kilometers about. And I thought, I just assumed everything in New York, every old building has a preservation group attached to it. So I assumed someone must be working to preserve it or working on it and trying to stop it from being demolished. But I asked around and no one was doing anything. So I went to my first community board meeting, which is sort of the localist, smallest level of government in New York City. And I'd never been to one of those meetings, and sat next to another guy who I didn't know. And by the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only 2 people interested in the project. Most people either just didn't care or they actually really wanted to tear it down. So we got talking afterwards, and we exchanged business cards, and I said, well, I'm very busy, why don't you start something? And he said, well, I'm busier, you start it. And so we sort of compromised, well, maybe we'll do something together. And that's how we started this whole effort. But the first thing we did was we asked the railroad that owned it if we could go up, because this is all we had seen was the steel structure from below. And when we went up there, this is what we found. which was basically a mile and a half of wildflowers running right through the middle of the city. And it had this like magical feeling. I don't know, y'all have more space than we do in Melbourne. I know y'all complain about your real estate like we do and say it's too expensive, but New York real estate is also very expensive, and we have tiny apartments. And I've heard a lot of people have this dream that I've had, where you're in your dream and you all of a sudden discover an extra door in your apartment that leads to this whole other room that you didn't realize you have. And that's what it was like going up there. It was like there was a whole nother space that I had no idea was in my own neighborhood, in my own city. And these juxtapositions of sort of nature taking over, this man-made structure. So we got started, and we didn't have a lot going for us in the beginning. We really didn't even have a plan. I mean, it was basically let's just stop it from being demolished, and let's think about other options besides tearing it down. We definitely didn't have any money, and I'll talk a little bit later about money because that's an important part of this story and an ongoing part. And then we had no relevant experience at all. These are the two things that I had spent most of my time involved with in my 20s. One, I helped start an AIDS HIV website that was called thebody.com. But it was a for-profit. It wasn't that I was so altruistic. And I helped start a in-flight catalog. I don't know if in airplanes you have those catalogs in the back seat. So we started one of those where we sold nose hair trimmers. And I was a part-time painter. So really no relevant experience. And just in case you think I might have an incredible green thumb, this is a picture of my terrace at the time. So as you can see, the planting had nothing to do with me. But it proved to be and Josh, the other co-founder, was a travel writer. And that lack of experience actually proved to be one of the most important things in getting this done, and actually turned out to be sort of an asset, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But, so I came from sort of a for-profit startup, and so one of the first things I wanted to do was I wanted a logo. And it had two goals. One, we were just working out of our own, apartments. We didn't have an office, and so the logo, if you have a fancy logo, people think, oh, well, something must be happening here. And two, more importantly, I think we wanted to make a commitment to design, that we knew this project was so unlikely and probably would never happen, but if it did, we didn't want to just stick a stairwell up there and a planter and a bench and call it a day. We wanted to make a commitment that if people helped us do this, we were going to make design important all the way through. So we spent a lot of time on our brochures, on our websites, deliberating font sizes for invitations. And I'm going back to this photo because the other way that we promoted this, when we first went up there, we took pictures with our cameras. And they looked like weeds growing on the railroad, which is, what was happening. But we wanted something a little more powerful. So we had a photographer, Joel Sternfeld, go up there. And he took pictures over the course of the year in all different seasons. And this was the most powerful tool in selling the Highline. We learned to speak less and show this photo more. And the other thing is that when you start these kind of projects, there's a lot of pressure that people want to know what you're going to build. Like, okay, you want to save it, what are you going to design? What are you going to build? Show me designs. And one, we didn't have any and didn't know what was going to go up there. And two, we proved it was much more powerful to let people imagine for themselves what should be up there. Because it let a lot of different kinds of people sort of come together on the project. You had preservationists that just wanted to save it. You had people that were interested in the native grasses. You had people that were interested in the rail history. You had architecture buffs that thought it was a great place to build something new up there. So it allowed us to create a really wide base of support. We're not the first people to build a park up on an old elevated rail line. They'd done one in Paris several years before us. And, it wasn't really a design inspiration. It was sort of an anti-design inspiration for me. I went there and it was very nice, but it was just a park on an elevated rail line. But what was great about it was that it proved that it worked. Someone else had done it, and it's always good when Paris had done it because people think Paris is so smart, or at least New Yorkers do. And so that was helpful, and that people actually used it. That was a huge an asset for us. We had now the High Line is so popular, but when we started it had a lot of opposition. And leading the opposition was our mayor, Mayor Giuliani at the time. And he really wanted to tear it down. We actually had to sue him and the city. He signed a demolition order 2 days before he left office. And at first it was a very scary opponent because he was a very powerful mayor. But quickly we learned that opposition could also be an asset, because Giuliani actually was not very popular among New Yorkers, especially in Manhattan. And so we could always say, well, Giuliani really hates it. And they said, oh, that must be a great idea. I would love to help. The other thing is, the traditional support weren't really behind this. The community board, where Josh and I first met, actually did not favor. They wanted to tear the High Line down. They thought it was an eyesore. From a city's planning standpoint, honestly, you wouldn't think it was a great thing. Elevated walkways don't have a great history. It sort of cut off the neighborhood. And so we had to rely on our own community, and Josh and I were both gay. And so, a lot of our supporters early on were, our gay friends. And I had a friend from college that came to one of our first events, and he said, wow, there are a lot of men at this event. And this is a picture of Florent, who was a famous restaurateur that had a French bistro right next to the High Line. And he was one of the first business owners that supported it. And every Bastille Day, he would dress up as Marie Antoinette. And that time he had a train that went around his hat. And this is a poster for a talk I'm not going to give, Behind the Bushes, The Secret Homo History of the High Line, where we really talked a lot about the role that gays played in this, but also interesting, and I don't know if that's true here, but the role that gays have played over the decades in the preservation movement. There's a great quote by one of the architecture writers from the New York Times that said, the secret story of preservation in New York is the alliance of gay men and rich, straight, white women. And so we sort of elaborated on that, and the poster really has no purpose in the talk, but just to keep you awake. And I said, is it okay if I put the semi-nude slide in here, in Melbourne? And they said, definitely, it's fine. So Giuliani was against it. Our next mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, when he ran for office, was very supportive. When he got in office, it was a little harder. 9/11 had happened. New York was in a huge economic crisis. And so we knew that the pretty pictures of the High Line weren't going to convince him. The naked pictures, we knew were not going to convince him. So we needed to make an economic argument that this made financial sense. So we hired a firm called HRNA, a guy named John Alschuler, who does economic feasibility studies, mostly for developers or cities trying to build projects and get bank or bond financing. So we said, what if the High Line over a 20-year time period would create more money in incremental tax revenues than it costs to build? And the city said, that would be interesting. So we looked at different ways the High Line could create value. One is when a structure or a park creates a whole district. So we started calling it the High Line District. And this is a map by actually the woman that did the logo, Paula Scher. She also is a painter. And she painted this map for us of all of the different neighborhoods and things that the High Line could connect and create this district. But the real way parks create value, or the best example is Central Park. But we knew Central Park is so popular that the High Line could never be like Central Park. So we looked at these small pocket parks, and property anywhere between 2 to 3 blocks away from these parks, it comes up in value 5 to 15%. So the study showed that we thought it would cost about $100 million to build, and we thought it would create about $250 million in incremental tax revenues for the city. We got both of those numbers wrong. And the good news, this convinced the mayor to come on board, and he really got behind this project. But we got both those numbers wrong. It's cost so far about $150 million to build, and we're not done. And a new study has shown that it'll create almost $1 billion in new tax revenues over 20 years for the city. So this is an example of a public-private partnership. You can only get so far with these kind of projects fighting City Hall. So not only did the city, it would have been easy for the mayor just to say, oh, well, I support it. But he really had to get behind it. We had a lot of our other elected officials. It's Hillary Clinton when she was the senator. The mayor brought us about over $100 million in construction funds. Hillary and our other senator, Chuck Schumer, brought us about $20 million. And I love this slide because none of them are looking, all these politicians learned to stand together and not look at each other. I'm sure yours are much friendlier. But, even with the mayor on board and all this political support, the property owners underneath it wanted to tear it down because the railroad actually didn't own any land. They just owned this structure, and they owned 20 feet of easement above the structure. So people underneath it owned air rights below it and above it. So they still wanted to tear it down, and they started actually suing us to get it to tear it down. So we needed to do a rezoning. And the way, and this might get a little too technical, but it's one of the most important parts of this project, is in New York, when you own property, you can only sell your air rights to your neighbor. And if your neighbor doesn't need them, there's no value in your air rights. And one of the most famous preservation cases in New York is Grand Central. And one of the things that saved it was the city allowed the railroad that owned it, which was actually New York Central that actually built the High Line, coincidentally, to transfer their development rights anywhere in a neighborhood. And so what it does is it creates a market for those air rights and actually makes them much more valuable. And it doesn't matter if the High Line's there or not, because they can move it anywhere in a neighborhood. It's only been done 3 times. It was done for Grand Central. It was done to save the theaters in Times Square, the Broadway theaters, and it was done to save the High Line. Now, it also had consequences not everyone liked. This is a map of the buildings, what it looked like before the zoning, and this is a map of what we project once it's fully built out. So a transfer of development right can also lead to higher buildings and higher density. Some of the good things were that we tried to keep the density. Those middle blocks is a historic district, so we tried to keep the density at the end away from the older historic buildings. But even with the zoning, still no one knew what the High Line was, and we had no money to build it. So people kept saying, why don't you do a design competition? But we didn't have any money to build it. We didn't own it. We were still fighting, for support. And so we did an ideas competition. And the ideas didn't have to be realistic. We said, come up with whatever you want. And this was my favorite for many reasons, which is a mile-long lap pool that would go through the city. And we had entries from 36 countries. This is one from Russia that was more like an art piece. We had political manifestos. This is one about imprisoning people in the I-beams of the High Line. This, I think, is playing on High and High Line. And this one is more about programming, which proves to be one of the most important parts. It's not just about the design of what you build on it, but it's about what happens on and around the space that really makes it successful. This is my other favorite, which is an urban roller coaster. You'd see in people's bedrooms and zoom down. Now, the neighborhood had sort of gotten around and slowly was coming around to the High Line. When they saw this, they got very nervous. And this is where it was really helpful that Josh and I weren't architects or planners. We couldn't come up with our own plan for the High Line. So we always said we wanted the neighborhood. I just wanted to throw. We did an exhibition of all those designs at Grand Central at that railroad station. Not just because of the history of the zoning, but more to make sure this wasn't just a local project. That this wasn't. It was important for the neighborhood, but it was important for the whole city. So one of the things we did, and we said people in the city should decide what goes up there. And so this is a postcard we sent out to people as soon as we finished the ideas competition, before we even started a design competition, asking people, what do they want? What do you want? And this was our very first community input session. And, this was, and I think this is a really important part of the process because, one, we weren't going to design it, but we also didn't want to do everything the community said. We've seen community process that are so consensus-driven that try to take every piece of input, and then you sort of come out with mush. So what we did is we had a community input session. We put all the input in the brief for the design competition. And so when people were submitting their ideas, they knew what the community was thinking about. And then once we hired a design team, we made them meet with the community over and over. And what we told people is, we're not going to take every suggestion, but we're going to incorporate, what we're hearing, and we're going to report back. And the things we're not going to do, we're going to explain why we're not going to do them. And we put all of the comments and all of our responses online so everyone could see that. This is one of the responses we got. The High Line should be preserved, untouched as a wilderness area. No doubt you will ruin it, so it goes. And I kept this, it's still above my desk, because this was my biggest fear. This was magical. It was magical walking up there. But it was just us, or just a small handful of people. And we knew we had to remove everything that was there, to put in new drainage, to remediate it. There was toxic soil. So you couldn't just leave it as is. And so how do you recreate that magic? So what we did is we did a design competition, we incorporated, and what the community said, what the community had fallen in love with, was those pictures I had shown you earlier from Joel Sternfeld. People wanted that wild landscape. And we had 4 finalists. Zaha Hadid, the architect, was one of them, and in the interview I asked her why she had no trees up on this design, and she said, oh, well, trees are just things architects put when they don't know what to do with the space. And I actually really like her work, but I realized she was not a good fit for us. And she's actually now building a residential building right next to the High Line. Michael Van Valkenburg and Julie Bargman, 2 landscape architects. Stephen Hall, an architect who had a much more architectural idea. And then this is the winning team. And the lead is a landscape architect, and I think that's very important because this is at its soul a landscape project. And the lead is James Corner, Field Operations with Dillers, Gafidio, and Renfro, and Pete Uldorf. And this was their very first competition entry. And the idea was this concrete planks that would go through this natural landscape. And the idea is the concrete planks could be used in different ways, where you need for more people, where it can have less people, where it would cut through the structure, it would actually ramp over the planting. And it would sort of blur the line between the hard and the soft. It would almost be like the planting is sort of taking back the walkway. And although the design is thought to be very innovative, on one hand it was very simple. There were about 20 different forms of these concrete planks, and then they were used as like a kit of parts. And they're basically parking curbs in different shapes. And so that's one of the things I love about it, is using sort of a very common, easy material, but in a different way. And this is a picture of them being installed. We put the rail tracks back where they were. Here you can see when the planting is coming up, through it. And there's that sort of nature sort of reclaiming the path. And some of the planks peel up to form the benches and the furniture. The planting by Pete Uldorf is sort of, I asked him one time, I said, should I call this a natural landscape? And he said, actually, there's nothing natural about it. It's idealized nature. It was inspired by that wild landscape, but it's actually, flowers are coming up almost every 2 weeks. It's all perennial, so we never cut it back. And one of the things I love about Pete is he picks a lot of his plants for what they look like in the fall and in the winter. He's famous for saying brown is a color too. That landscapes shouldn't just all be about pinks and yellows and flowers. And he picks some of these plants specifically for what they look like after they're dead. The lighting was done by Hervé Descote from L'Observatoire, and the idea was that it was always from the side. Normally, when you're in a park, you have overhead light, and you have this light like this, which is very unflattering, in your eyes. You can't, I can barely see y'all out there. And so when you're in a park, you can't really see the city around you, you can't see the planting. So the idea of it all from the side is, and we put it sort of in the railing, it's LED lighting, is that you can see the pathway and the plants, but your eyes adjust so you can see the city around you. And it's actually very flattering as well. And a friend of mine said that, if people didn't already know you were gay, they would definitely know you were gay, that you built a dimmer in your park. And this is a spot where it goes through the building where we had a big fight with the Parks Department, because the Parks Department said, we've never put a dimmer in any park, we don't need a dimmer. But we argued it was very important. The other thing, one of the architects, Rick Scafidio, said that his job as an architect was to save the structure from architecture. Instead of adding, it was about subtracting. And this is one of the staircases at 14th Street, where you can see they removed this big steel beam there to create a stairwell that goes right through the structure. So you sort of walk up into the middle of the landscape. Here is what we call the 10th Avenue Square, and the idea was to build an amphitheater, to remove that steel, put in glass, and then put in amphitheater seating right over 10th Avenue. So there you can see one slide with the steel beams after they were cut, and there you can see when the glass is put in place. And it becomes this amphitheater of the city. And I think one of the things that's so different about the High Line, as most parks in New York follow the Central Park model. And Central Park was built to be an escape. It was meant, you go to Central Park and you can feel like you're out in the countryside. The High Line is not an escape from the city. It's part of the city. It's views like this of traffic that make the High Line special. And instead of, hiding the city away, it enables you to see the city in different ways. It also, people say they come on the High Line to see the city and plants. I think they're also coming just people watching as one of the big activities on the High Line. And one of the most famous cases of people watching was at the Standard Hotel. This hotel was built right when we opened. And the rooms are very small, so if you come out of your bathroom without a towel, people can see you. And it became people would just stand and watch. And I think some people in the hotel were maybe doing things on purpose. But it's, and you can stand and see people just sitting there looking up there hoping, to see something. But then there's also a different kind of sort of voyeurism of sort of the city. And so the High Line used to be covered in advertising. And so the designers here took sort of the frame of the advertising, lit it, and then it frames people on the High Line, but then it frames the city itself. And those buildings you see are social housing. There's 2 large low-income social housing projects next to the High Line. And these are things people in the city really don't want to see. So, one of the things they were doing is framing that city, sort of forcing people to look at everything in the city. Here's an elevated walkway on an elevated walkway that takes you through sort of a canopy of trees. There you can see it from above. This is, so we opened section 1 of the High Line in 2009. We opened the next section in 2011. This is where the High Line currently ends, at 30th Street. It's created a huge boom in development. This is a map of over 40 different projects that have happened in and around the High Line. And keep in mind, this is in one of the worst financial times ever for New York. And one of the great things, it's not just more development, but it's actually a lot of interesting development. There's a spot where you can stand here at 18th Street and see buildings by Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Shigeru Ban, Annabelle Seldorf. This is actually where the Hadid building is going to go, and we know there's going to be no trees there. This is the Whitney Museum, which is one of our most important museums of American art, is actually moving from the Upper East Side down to the base of the High Line. This is a building by Renzo Piano that'll open in 2015. And it's created about $2 billion in new developments. That's different than the tax revenues. That's just in new developments from 2009 to 2012. Incredible number of jobs. It's been very important for tourism. We thought the High Line would get about 300,000 people a year. That's what a medium-sized museum gets. Last year we got over 4.5 million visitors. This puts it in perspective of other sites. It's getting over 1 million more than the Statue of Liberty. which is great. On one hand, it's great for businesses in the neighborhood. There's a restaurant that said, thank you, you're putting my kids through college. And the recession ended the day the High Line opened. But it also has another side that's not as good, is that it's a lot of tourists, and not to say we don't love you Australians coming to the High Line. But the most important people for us are the locals. And we always want the High Line to really feel like it's owned by New Yorkers. And so we do that through programs. We do over 450 free programs throughout the year. And we could do a lot of, and anybody can participate in it, but we do the kind of programs that locals want. We have salsa dancing. We have a lot of kids programs. That's where we really focus our times. And you're welcome to bring your kids on our kids program, but it tends to be mostly locals. We do hundreds of school field trips. And then going back to that social housing I talked about earlier, this is something that's been an interesting issue in that they have not benefited from the changes in the neighborhood. The rising rents have pushed out a lot of the stores where they used to shop at. They haven't been hired by a lot of the new businesses coming in. And when we opened the High Line, we found that a lot of them weren't coming to the High Line. And so we did a survey of people that lived there, and they said they felt like the High Line wasn't for them. They felt like they didn't see people that looked like them. And so we've done a whole outreach effort to make sure the High Line is for everyone in the neighborhood. And one of the most important ways we do that is through jobs. We have a teen hiring program. We have a whole group of teens that we hire from the neighborhood to help us create our program, so we make sure we're doing programs that they want to be a part of. Another important part of the programs we do is art. The High Line runs through Chelsea, which is home to more galleries than anywhere else in the world. But it's not that accessible. I mean, sometimes when I go in galleries, I feel like I'm not wanted there. It's not meant to be welcoming a lot of times. So we wanted to bring contemporary art to the park, to the public. So this is actually the only permanent piece of art on the High Line. The rest of it is all temporary. We do about 35 different works every year. This was this artist's interpretation of a bird feeder. This is a billboard where every other month we do a different artwork. This was the work that was up last month by Gilbert and George. We also do video art at 2 spots along the High Line, and this is something that people don't get a lot of exposure to video art. So we're giving the chance for these artists to show their work, to hundreds of thousands of people. This is a sculpture that's on view now. And sometimes the works are very big. This is a sculpture that covered a whole wall by a Nigerian-born artist named El Natsui. And sometimes the works are very small, and you sort of have to look for them. And the other kind of programming we do, we always want the High Line to sort of be fresh and new. And so there was a parking lot next to the High Line where a developer was going to build a building, but he had a few months where he wasn't using it. So we asked him if we could have it for the summer. And underneath it, we put in food trucks and a beer garden, and then we built a roller skating rink right next to it as a way, of just different things for reasons for people to come to the High Line. And I don't know if I would have done it. Building a roller skating rink in New York City was actually harder than building the High Line. But people loved it because there's sort of no more roller skating rinks left. So I talked a little bit about Central Park earlier on. Another way that Central Park was a model is that Central Park is privately maintained. Probably a lot of people aren't aware of that. But in the 1970s, it had fallen into disuse. That great lawn was basically all dust. And there was a woman who lived on the Upper East Side who decided she wanted to start restoring part of it. So she raised money privately to restore one of the lawns. And eventually that group she started morphed into the Central Park Conservancy that manages and operates Central Park for the city. The city only pays for 15% of their $40 million budget. And it's the same for the High Line, except even more extreme, in that we get no city funding. We pay 100% of the cost of maintaining and operating the High Line. So that's Johnny, one of our 8 gardeners, and that's Judith, one of our maintenance workers. They're all employees of Friends of the High Line, that organization that Josh and I just sort of started after we exchanged business cards. And working, in all kinds of weather. We also, pay for all of the programming. It's about $8 million a year for everything. This is actually an older picture of our staff. We're a little bigger now. We have about 60 full-time staff. And this is one of my biggest worries is how do we keep paying for this? One of the biggest mistakes we made is we don't have any way of capturing all the value we're creating. So we're creating an incredible amount of value for the private developers and the city, but none of that is coming back to the park. And so every year we have to rely on, private philanthropic support and, things like membership. And before I came on this trip, I asked the woman who runs our membership if we had any Australian members. And it turns out we have 80 Australian members who have paid to become members. So maybe some of y'all are here. Thank you. And the High Line is not done. There's still a last third to go. This is where it goes around the rail yards. This is the last undeveloped site in Manhattan. It was going to be home to, we were competing with London for that last Olympics. We lost. It was also going to be a football stadium. The community did not want this in their neighborhood. They fought, so it did not happen. But what is happening is a mixed-use development. So if you think of the Docklands, but a lot bigger, it's actually 12 million square feet of development. I'm not sure how that translates here. But if you can see, a lot of those buildings are taller than the Empire State Building. This is the first phase of the project that's already under construction. So one of the challenges, how do you build a park next to this kind of density? Very different than the rest of the neighborhood the High Line runs through. And so the designers, instead of sort of ignoring it and trying again to pretend you're not there, they're in some ways sort of celebrating this crazy urban density. And they build this bench that hangs over the side of the High Line and lets you look up the building, makes the buildings look even taller. We found in the first section of the High Line, you weren't allowed to walk on the rails, but this is what everyone wanted to do. So we're building this part where you can actually walk on the rails. I showed you that one bench we have. They've developed all different kinds of benches based on that first prototype. Picnic bench, my favorite is the seesaw bench. Here, I talked about the High Line being great for people watching. This is where sort of creating a catwalk where that middle walkway rises above and sort of allows people sitting on the side to watch the people going by. And then when you're up on the catwalk, you get this great view up and down 11th Avenue. And people really wanted a playground, someplace. Kids like the High Line, they run around, but there wasn't a place dedicated to kids. And we didn't want to build just a playground and a swing set. So what the designers came up with was this idea of you remove all the steel structure and you expose the steel beams, and then you put a rubberized play surface. So it creates this place for kids to play, but also it doesn't have to look like a typical playground. And I think adults will want to use it just as much, and I think it makes it better for kids. They don't feel like it's just for little kids. I said that we couldn't leave the walkway as is. Well, we realized we can't leave it there permanently because ultimately you have to remediate it and put in drainage, but you could leave it for 5 or 10 years. So since we didn't have enough money to finish the line, what we're doing is we're putting in a temporary walkway that's going to take you through this landscape, that same landscape that I first fell in love with 15 years ago, and this is the part I'm most excited about. This is under construction and we'll open this next year. So, I've always had 3 goals for the High Line. One, that it's a well-loved park by New Yorkers, and we're still having to work on that, and that's an ongoing challenge just because of sort of the over-success. And 2, I've always wanted the High Line to get better after I leave, that it's not dependent on Josh or I, and I'm stepping down at the end of this year. I feel like we built a great team that's going to carry this forward, that it's going to go on in perpetuity. But 3, my third goal was that it inspires other people to start their own kind of projects, that they didn't need, and this is a picture of one of my favorites called the Low Line. Because Josh and I had no experience. We didn't have any money. We weren't urban planners. And so this is one of my favorites because it's by these 2 guys that live on the Lower East Side. They discovered this underground trolley terminal that had been abandoned for 60 years. And so their idea is to use fiber optics to take light underground and turn this abandoned space, into a park. And this is just, a map of, or a slide of some of the other projects, either inspired by the High Line or projects we've talked to. And, to me, there's some interesting elevated rail lines being turned into public spaces. But to me, it's just, what's great is seeing people in their own neighborhood, take sort of generally sort of industrial spaces and repurposing them and sort of partnering with government to make that happen. But one of the things that's been most gratifying for me is just how people use the space. So I talked about the ways that we use it. We want to do roller skating or art or kids programs. But the real test of a public space is that people just take ownership of it. And when we first opened the High Line, we accidentally shone a light from the stairs was misdirected into a woman's bedroom. And she called our offices to complain, and we weren't able to do anything about it. So like any good New Yorker, she found a friend of hers who was a singer, and she put her on the fire escape and started this thing called the High Line Renegade Cabaret. And she would serenade the people on the High Line. And it became, this is a cartoon from the New Yorker that they did of it. It became like an event until the fire department shut it down, because it turns out this is not what you're supposed to do with fire escapes. But to me, it's a great symbol of people coming up with different uses. I mean, the High Line was a mistake. It's just a series of mistakes. I mean, the trains were running down the street. There were people getting killed. Then they elevated it. Then it was no longer used. It was abandoned. Then we turned it into a park. And to me, that's what I hope, and that's what I hope after I leave, that it continues to find sort of reinvention, by New Yorkers. So thank you for having me. And if you're interested in learning more, we wrote a book about sort of from this journey from 99 to 2009 when we first opened it. And I think we're now going to go to questions.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. May I now introduce our other panellists who are going to sit with Robert and have a little bit of a conversation. Firstly, Ruth Fincher. Ruth Fincher is Professor of Geography at the University of Melbourne, where she's been Professor of Urban Planning before as well. Being a social geographer of cities, she's interested in how the built form of cities caters, if it does, to different groups of people, and how those different groups of people create meaningful places in their cities. Councillor Arron Wood has a strong interest in the environment. He is Chair of the Environment Portfolio and the Deputy Chair of the Economic Development Portfolio at the City. He sits on the Inner Melbourne Climate Adaptation Network, the Parks and Gardens Advisory Committee, and is a board member of the Port Phillip and Western Port Catchment Management Authority. I think you can tell the difference between Arron and Ruth. Ruth, first of all to you, what are your impressions of Robert's presentation? Thoughts, ideas?
Okay. Well, I just was blown away, Robert, and as I'm sure we all were, by this extraordinary achievement of design, and your energy just shows through, as I'm sure something which was a really crucial part of it. My sort of thinking about it as a first impression was really what a contribution to the public realm this has made. And I wanted to comment on the notion of public that is here. And I was really pleased that you commented on the social housing being framed as a part of the outlook of the project. But I wanted to really ask you whether this is really a gentrifying phenomenon, and how can you get beyond getting young people to come and be workers on the site, which is a wonderful thing to do, to have employment associated with that. Can this ever become part of the whole public, do you think? Or will it always be, even for the locals, only some members of the public that really feel at home in it?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we think a lot about. And, one of the things that is really heartening to me is how many volunteers that we have. And so those, not everyone is always not everyone uses every park. So I think it's really about creating a diverse community that does use it. And that's where the important issue is that it really is diverse, that it's representative of everyone that lives in the neighborhood. And what we found by hiring people from the neighborhood is if you just do programs for people, they come for the programs and they leave. When we've hired these kids, their friends come, because they're working up there, and it creates, and then they come back, even after they've hired, they feel like they own it. They feel like it's partly theirs, and that was always the key to the success of this project, is that so many people felt that they had ownership of it. And so, if you're just running programs for people, you don't feel like you own it. But if the kids are actually running the programs, they man every aspect of the programs that they create. And so I think that's where their hope is. But we don't have all the answers, and I mean, this is one of the things I think is challenging for a lot of public spaces.
Yeah. I agree, and there's no such thing as a homogeneous public. I mean, there's all sorts of people that make it up. I mean, in my own discipline of geography, as everyone so kindly mentioned, we have some really famous studies of parks in New York City, particularly Tompkins Square Park in the Lower East Side in the late 1980s, where there was a real battle between gentrifying and homelessness, and lots of people who were homeless came to occupy the park, that one. I don't know whether it was common in others. And so restrictions were set up to prevent them from being there. And so is that a common thing? Is that part of your park as well?
It's not an issue for us.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have any, partly because we close at night.
Yeah.
Entrances. We also, it's so busy.
Yes.
Homeless people tend to go to parks that are less underutilized.
Yeah.
And we're so busy, it's the same reason we also have no crime. We've had, over 15 million visitors and no serious crime on the line, which was something people were very worried about, because they thought it was going to be dangerous up there.
Yeah. Anyway,
Arron, what are your thoughts? Have you found some things you're going to
loved it.
might take to council or something?
Well, I think, I was actually on the High Line this year, and it's a great space. I think, what I loved about it too is that public artwork. So it was starting a conversation not just about the High Line itself, but bringing public art in was also good. I think for us, one of the things that we're blessed with in the City of Melbourne is the fact that we do have a lot of parks. We've got, particularly on the eastern side, some fantastic parks. I think what I like about this, though, is the sort of organic way that it grew, and that seems to me to be very Melbourne. So, one of the things that I love about Melbourne is I love our laneways. And, Sydney's tried to copy our laneways, and I don't think they've done a great job of it. But that's because, of course, they're from Sydney, and there's this rivalry going on here. But I think, what we will see in Melbourne is starting to not just love your laneways, but actually love your rooftops. So love your rooftops, love your walls, and the Growing Green Guide's actually out at the moment, so a bit of a plug for that. And that's actually looking at the ways that we can grab back some of these underutilised spaces and turn them green.
The fact that this site is elevated is absolutely critical to it, isn't it? I mean, it gives you different perspectives that people wouldn't normally see. It's part of the excitement of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also when you normally come to New York and you go up in the Empire State Building, and you look at this grand view of the High Line. When you actually go up 3 stories, it actually looks quainter, and it's this view you don't normally get. I mean, speaking of elevated, I went to Silo, the restaurant on the laneway on Hardware Street by Juiced.
Yep.
Juiced. And it was really exciting to see, what he was looking at doing on rooftops of, greening them and not just, but growing the food and then using everything. I mean, that's the kind of thing I think, we could use more of in New York.
I think that's the thing too is, is these open spaces are fantastic, but then it's also how do we look at urban food production. One of the projects that I love in the City of Melbourne is the rooftop honey. So, they actually have these hives up on the rooftops. And, straight away then you're starting a conversation around food production. So I think that, having these beautiful open spaces is one thing, but also actually, making them work for us is another thing as well.
Yeah, but Arron, don't you think, I mean, this is you and your greenie and food producing and plant self-talking. I mean, don't you think there's also an issue about love your old industrial infrastructure here? I mean, you're on council, so how good are we at this? I was astonished this thing was still there in the middle of New York City and Manhattan. How good are we at actually recognising old industrial bits of infrastructure, not just Flinders Street Station, but things that might be in Fisherman's Bend or on the docklands, the old sheds on the docklands. I mean, to me, I was really interested to hear Robert, your discussion of how in New York City every identifiable bit of oldness has a community group trying to preserve it.
Well, but you know, to your point, it's usually beautiful.
Just a second. I've got to respond to this accusation of being a hippie.
Exactly.
I think that, you know, one thing that we have done well is, you know, you look at Docklands and you look at sort of, you know, where we've actually used a lot of the old wharf timbers are used in some of the buildings down there. You know, we had preserved those.
I didn't see anything old at Docklands.
No.
I can assure you that there's old timber in Docklands. This is turning into a bit of a, you know.
Yeah, it says here I'm the moderator. I better start moderating.
Yes, moderate.
Go on, moderate.
Well, but I just to your point, I mean, I think it's a new. And I do see a lot of older buildings. I mean, interesting older buildings here. And I mean, this is a new, the very first historic district in New York, where they took, mostly historic districts are sort of traditionally beautiful buildings, like you have, you know, the Victorian. Our version is not quite as old. You know, beautiful brownstones. But there was an area called the Meatpacking that was old, you know, industrial, but they weren't an identifiable style. It was old industrial buildings. And they actually got that declared a historic district, and it was very controversial because it was not traditionally beautiful. But, you know, I think New Yorkers I think New York, it was interesting. The people that cared about the High Line when we started were the Dutch, Germans, and Japanese. Like, they loved the High Line before New Yorkers had embraced it, you know, before we even opened. Because I think they had a better history of sort of reusing these industrial
Okay, so what's a New Yorker scene around Melbourne? I happen to know that Robert's been here for a couple of weeks and he's recently acquired or borrowed a push bike. And he's been pushing around the city. He's actually been quite far afield. So I was actually interested, Robert, that you're going to finish up with the High Line shortly. And it's sometimes good to have external eyes come into your own city. I mean, I've been here for a long time, and maybe I don't see things the way you do. What have you? Maybe you'd like a job here. Maybe have you seen something? Have you seen something around Melbourne that you think, gee, we could do something with that?
I'd love that job, but I think one of the things a lot of people say, oh, we need a High Line, or we should High Line this building, or High Line this, you know. And the most, you know, I don't think that's always a good idea. I think what's really makes sense is where people see something in their own neighborhood, and you know, it needs to respond to the own history of the structure, the own history of the neighborhood, what makes sense for that neighborhood, and those are the projects to me that sort of come out of people's own desires that are sort of more interesting rather than just trying to, you know, build something that looks like the High Line, you know, in their city.
Yeah, I agree with that.
We've got a few long overdue projects or things that have been postulated for Melbourne, which probably should get done in due course, but we're probably looking for something a bit more exciting on the back of Robert's visit.
Yeah, I think, you know, I agree completely with Robert on the fact that you don't want to just grab the High Line, you know, or High Line and copy exactly that same sort of project. But there is a degree of inspiration there. I think that's the wonderful thing about it, that it is inspiring. I will say this, though. I love New York, but I love Melbourne more. You know, I think that, you know, there's a tendency to sort of look around and look at these other places and I guess, you know, to sort of see other things as better. But, you know, to walk through Fitzroy Gardens or to be in Flagstaff Gardens, they're just amazing places. We're so lucky here.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've never seen anything like the laneways. I mean, I was trying to think, we could copy that underneath the High Line.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Which is a very interesting space.
Many have tried, Robert, but not really successful.
Yeah. The best preserved industrial area of the CBD is the Queen Victoria Market Precinct, which is an area that hasn't been touched for 100 years. But tomorrow I'm being told by the journalists we're going to have a major announcement about the Queen Victoria Market Precinct. They're going to attempt to sell pieces of it in order to fund some paint job on the existing markets and so forth. I think it's very important, Robert, if you would like to go up there and spend some time looking about the market and looking about the bits of it that have been preserved and what they might think of selling off. And that's my comment at the moment. I don't know whether you've been up there to see it, have you?
I went today, actually, to the market to go buy, I wanted to buy a cheap counterfeit footy jersey for my nephews, and I was told that's where I could get them.
Which team? We have to know.
I just wanted a good-looking one, but it was closed
Bombers.
today. So
Bombers.
I got to look around it and to
Going
see the
cheap at the
structure. It was hard for me to understand what the history of it was, but I don't know what the future plans are.
Arron, can you reveal
Look,
anything?
I can't really say too much more about it, unfortunately. I'm going to have to use the commercial in confidence one. So, it's a really valid comment. I think, that when we've got, these big tracts of land that are so close to the city and have so much, I guess, buy-in from different people too. We've all been to the market. We've all, got veggies there or had some fun times. I think the Suzuki night market is fantastic. So when you've got a big tract of land like that, it's really important that you do the right thing with it. I think the issue, and Robert touched on this, is that whenever you want to do a public good open space, the issue of money comes up. So I think that, when you see the Queen Victoria Market proposal, it's a mix of getting money to pay for some new open space to upgrade the existing market facilities. But I'm quite excited about what sort of outcome we might get from that.
I was going to ask you, Rob, what are your annual on-costs? Can you reveal those to us?
Yeah, it costs us about $8 million a year to maintain the park. Part of that is because of all of the programs we do. We used to never call it a park because it's more of a cultural institution, and the level of planting is more like a botanical gardens. It's very hard to keep it looking that wild.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that faced with an issue something that required a lot of money, your response was to have a sort of almost like a crowdsourcing campaign of getting memberships and seeking private support for that in order to not knock it down or turn it into something completely different and commercial. Whereas I don't know whether we would do that here. Maybe we should.
I think that's where it's thinking big is very important, because I think even if we had dumbed down the idea and it cost half as much, if it wasn't innovated, we couldn't raise half the money. And so, if you do something really special, it's almost easier to raise a lot of money for something really special than to raise a little money for something that's mediocre.
So it needs to be a little bit ambitious to engage people.
Yep.
And I think the thing with money too is that sustainable funding models are really important. So one of the issues that we've got is we've got a developer contribution for open space, which is 8%. Now that's not popular with everyone, but it does a great job in providing open space. We actually had the Property Council of Australia come out and openly attack us for that 8% contribution. But
so what happens? So when you build a development, you have to give 8% of the
value of the development to open space
nearby.
Well, it goes into the open space fund, and it can actually be utilised right across the city. I think the good thing about that fund is that you've got supposedly a sustainable funding model to keep on reintroducing public space. And I was again interested, Robert, when you talked about the fact that all these properties along the High Line, the value of them goes up. And what we know is that, if your property happens to be lucky enough to be overlooking one of our beautiful parks and gardens, it's a much more highly valued property. So it's interesting that the Property Council would come out and attack that contribution when it actually adds value to the development anyway.
Does it go for construction costs or ongoing maintenance, or either one?
It goes into an open space contribution fund in terms of the development, and then what we do is we actually use that fund to try and grab more open space. So things like pocket parks, grabbing back a few car parks here and there, and I guess really trying to introduce more open space to the city.
I'm going to take this gentleman's question over here, Robert. Before we go tonight, I'm going to ask you, what do you think the High Line will look like in 2050?
Okay.
Think about how old you will be and where you might be, but just if you could just give us a bit of a crystal ball gaze into what it might be by then. Gentleman here.
That's very relevant to my question, actually, because I'm really interested. Been on the High Line twice in the last 12 months. I'm just blown away by the sophistication of the planting. And it's one of the things that can be easily overlooked in this process. It's easy to measure and describe the sophistication of the hard landscaping or the artwork on display there, but there's not a lot of vocab or measures by which you can describe the sophistication of the planting there. Just wondering what you believe, what proportion of the success of the High Line can be attributed to the incredible cleverness of that planting. You could have done it a whole lot more simply and it would have had the same quality as a space and all the rest of it. Why this commitment to such quality in the planting? I honour you for it. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got to give a lot of credit to our landscape architect, James Corner Field Operations, and Pete Uldoff, who is the horticulturalist. Because, you sort of captured it. It's even if you're not going up there, and I honestly, as you can see, my terrace, I'm not a plant person. People always show me their gardens thinking, I don't really care about gardens. But what the gardens do, I think, when they're done right, is they transform the way you experience space. And I think that's what slows people down. That's what changes. If you just had the views of the city, it's that you're in this sort of natural environment with those views. And then it just changes the way people behave. One of the things in New York, I haven't really seen it here very much. New York's not a romantic city. No one would ever hold hands walking in New York. I don't know if it's people are walking too fast but no one holds hands in New York. But you go up on the High Line and you see people holding hands. And I think that's just a sign of, they're slowing down. It's slowing down this fast-paced environment. And I think it's something about the planting that subconsciously does that. And, a lot of developers come and say, oh, we want to build a High Line, an elevated walkway between our buildings, and it's going to be like the High Line. And, that has not worked in the past, and it's not going to work in the future. And what makes the High Line different is that it is the greenery. People, it's not just about getting from A to B. You're coming up there to experience in a lot of cases, that the planting.
The seasonality of that, which is just so amazing. But then the challenge is, as Rob said, how you keep that going in perpetuity, because you can imagine the management of that stuff, some of which has a reasonably short lifespan, shelf life, so to speak.
Yep.
So, yeah, big challenges. Well done.
Thank you.
So for those that haven't been there, and I know you haven't done the landscape plan yourself, can you tell us which plants are there? They're not all local New York indigenous species, I'm presuming, and they're structured, they're designed to take particular shapes as they grow.
Yeah. I can't tell you very many names, but
we want
people always ask me, what's that plan? What's that plan? There's about 290 species up there, and a lot of them actually were growing there before. But what was interesting is the plants that were growing up there were not native. Right. They were mainly, a lot of them had actually hitched a ride on the railroad. So seeds had blown in the rail cars and then blown off on the High Line. So they were a lot of these invasive species. And that's one of the things I think is an opportunity for someone to do, is a park devoted, full of invasive species.
Well,
because they grow so well. And we were talking with a group about a sewage project here where there was an open space. And, I think a park full of Phragmites, I don't know if you have those.
Well, that's a global species.
That invasive that takes over wetlands and is so bad, but they can be sort of beautiful and sort of this Phragmite open space.
Well, that's a global species, and it's usually an indicator of high level of fitness in a water body, of good systems. So, and of course, those species that infiltrated and learned to grow there, they're pretty hardy and they adapted to that environment, because I'm presuming at times it's exposed to cold and snow in winter, and being elevated and up, less shaded part of it, gets hot in summer.
Yeah, we were worried that it would, I had this fear that it would just all die. Because it's like growing things on a highway. You said, it gets colder in the winter and it bakes in the summer, and there's only about this much soil in most places, so it's very little soil. And so, again, hats off to our team that came up with the right plants. And it's actually one of the biggest problems we're having is it's thriving too fast, and we're having to remove things. The trees are growing much faster than we thought. We're having to thin them out.
I got light. There's a question here.
Hi guys, my name's Nick. I'm an urban planning student from the Uni of Melbourne. You mentioned that the neighbourhood was one of the biggest assets in terms of the High Line project. You could constantly consult with them as to the direction of the project. In Melbourne, we're sort of confronting a time where there's big new residential redevelopments where a residential community is not necessarily existing in the first place to consult with. How would you confront those challenges?
I'm not sure I completely understand that. How do you consult with the community?
So I'm saying we're trying to develop new communities in places like Docklands and Fisherman's Bend, where there's not necessarily a large residential population at the moment to guide the development. How would you confront that challenge?
I mean, I was knocking the Docklands, but earlier, but I think it's much harder to develop communities from scratch. I mean, I think that is the real challenge. And it's a real challenge to me from a design standpoint, because I think one of the things that makes neighborhoods is this mix of old and new, which we were lucky to have, which, you know, when you're building something from scratch, like on the Docklands, that's much more difficult. And then when you don't have an existing population, I think that's also hard. As much as community boards and sort of the NIMBYism and complaints of an existing, can drive you crazy, they also provide sort of that fabric. So I think that is, to me, a challenge I don't really have an answer for, is how do you develop something from scratch?
I think too, Docklands it cops a fair bit, and in many cases rightly so. You had a development there where it was about maximising return on investment, I think. You sort of had a lot of big boxes put there, and we had issues with wind whistling through and all sorts of different issues. And then it was handed back to City of Melbourne. So what you got is you got a state government which was essentially developing a community, whereas the City of Melbourne, I think, is much better at doing that. So we're happy to have Docklands back, even if we do get a ribbing for it sometimes. And I think that Docklands, has amazing potential. So we've just built the Docklands Library. That'll come online very shortly. One of the really small pieces of, engineering community there is the community garden. So it's the first community garden that we've actually built without a fence around it. And there's been no rates of vandalism. There's been this amazing sense of community where, people are coming down out of their apartments and actually having these conversations about this veggie garden. And when it first went in, we had some issues where the restaurateurs were taking too much. And it's a community-run garden, so some of the great community members sort of gave them a friendly tap on the shoulder and just told them to be a little bit more sharing. And so that's a wonderful conversation.
A sharing chef.
To have,
That's interesting.
A sharing and caring chef.
Yes, and leave the rosemary alone. And the other thing I thought was really interesting from Robert's presentation was the way you created temporary spaces, so the roller skating rink out of the area that was vacant. And one of the real prompts to placemaking amongst local residents in a place, even where there aren't too many people, is to have these temporary activities that can occupy relatively vacant places. So that's one of the ways.
I mean, two other thoughts that I had is, one of the things that's helpful is for something to develop more slowly. Yeah. I mean, sometimes there's pressure and you have to develop it right now. But over time, that's when you can find out like how things are going to be used, what's needed. I mean, a good example in New York is Dumbo down under the Brooklyn Bridge. And there was one developer, it was mostly one private developer, that owned all of this land. And what he did early on was brought in artists. I mean, partly because he couldn't rent it to anyone else, but brought in these small businesses. And what he's done is he's also kept them there as the rates have increased to create sort of a more interesting social fabric.
And it's another one that we're really trying to work with, again, sort of using this common theme of Docklands. Is the Renew Docklands project is a similar sort of thing, where any of those spaces that are currently vacant at the moment, their Renew Docklands actually gets in artists and architects, and people are using those spaces there on a sort of month-to-month rent, if you like, for free, and they get to use those spaces. So it's again, those smaller sort of projects at that micro level, that really what a sense of community is all about. And I agree, it's very difficult to master plan a community or master plan a community that's going to be rich, and that's why these little small things are so important.
Gentleman here has a question.
I'm going to be a bit greedy and just ask two questions. The first one is if you've heard of our pop-up patch that we've got in Fed Square and what you thought of that. And also just the rooftop gardens you mentioned before, what plans there were in the future for that.
What was the first question?
If you've heard of our pop-up patch that's in Fed Square, it's similar to a community garden where people rent small blocks of soil and grow their own food effectively, just behind Federation Square.
No, I hadn't. I don't think I'd heard of that. I went to see Ceres. Is that how you say it?
Ceres.
Which was amazing to see all of those community gardens there. In terms of the urban gardening, which was interesting, talking at the the silo group. I've always been against, they've always wanted to plant food on the High Line, which I'm convinced as soon as I leave, they're going to start planting food, because I've stopped them from planting food up there. Because I love, rooftop gardens, but I don't think every park has to have growing food as part of it. And so, partly it's just me snobby aesthetics that it doesn't always look good. But one of the things I think would be great is to actually do that, grow it in roofs around the High Line. So as you're going on the High Line, you could see these rooftops, and people have done a honey. We were trying to decide if we wanted to put a beehive on because there's so many bees now on the High Line because all the flowers. And so instead they put it on a rooftop away from the High Line. So you can see it, but it's not, no one's getting stung.
Now, just on that also as an extension, I'll come back to I think you had a second question, but Mayor Bloomberg's been, I forget when it was, soon in his term, that he announced that New York was going to be the greenest city in the world. Has there been experimentation with green buildings around, like vertical buildings? I know that around the world there are some good examples now emerging. Have any of the buildings around the High Line wanted to do that sort of thing as well?
Yeah, you mean green walls?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sort of pessimistic on the green wall. I mean, we looked at doing some on the High Line. They're really hard to maintain, and they often also don't do great in the winter, and so there's just a real high maintenance cost. So sometimes I question the environmental benefits of that. But no, hope someone will try, but no one's done it yet.
And again, that's the whole purpose of the Growing Green Guide, is to actually look at how we grow green better on our walls, on our roofs, and there's some good demonstration projects out at Burnley as well. Because you're right that everyone sort of says let's have a green roof or let's have a green wall, and I think one of the issues that the City of Melbourne had initially was when we had this beautiful picture of the city and every roof was green in it, and we kind of made a noose for our own necks on that one. Because not every roof structurally can take a green roof. Not every place can support green infrastructure. And when you're looking at the temperatures that we get in Australia, sometimes it's extremely difficult. The other one is the urban forest strategy, and that's, I guess, where we're trying to have the city in a forest rather than the forest in the city. And what we're looking to do there is actually double the canopy cover for the city over the next 20 years. We're doing that because it looks good. Obviously Melbourne's known for its parks and gardens, but we're also doing it because it reduces the heat island effect. So, Melbourne's about 4 degrees hotter because of it's highly urbanised than the surrounding areas, and I know New York gets pretty hot as well. So what that does is it's one of our easiest ways to actually keep the city cool. So it's good environmentally, it's good economically, and it's also good socially as well. And it does actually reduce crime rates. So places that are green and look good, they actually have attributed drops in crime rates due to it.
Have you got a thought about urban heat islands and things like that, Ruth, in your thoughts about
indeed.
cities?
Not my area. I want to ask a non-plant question. Can I ask a non-plant question? I'm surrounded by planty people here. I want to know about the sort of crowdsourcing subscription idea and whether that's a sustainable basis in your experience, Robert. If we were here to say to ourselves, gee, the lesson we're going to take from Melbourne is that people can actually start to support some projects that aren't in the view of the state government or city government, and we really can try and get some money to support them. Is that, in your experience, a sustainable thing? I mean, we've just done it in Australia with the Climate Council, which a federal body which was disestablished or attempted to be disestablished by the federal government. So I want to ask about that.
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's complicated because I think crowdsourcing is great for getting things started. So I showed pictures of the Low Line, the underground park. Yeah. They raised, I think, $300,000 on Kickstarter to fund a prototype. But what you really, and I wish we had Kickstarter when it would have been quicker. But what you need ongoing is you need membership, which is different than crowdsourcing. Yes. Crowdsourcing tends to come in around an idea, get there, they give the money, and then they want the project, and they don't. So one of the things people always say, well, why don't you just put a box on the High Line where people can put in $5? One, the city won't let us. But two, I don't really want someone's $5 because I want them to become a member for $30, and I want their address and email so I can get them to
Yes.
give $30 again next year.
Absolutely.
So, a one-time doesn't do it for us when you're doing ongoing maintenance. So then you're going back to a more traditional model, which is membership, which is challenging when you have nothing, when you're a free park. So, I think that's an ongoing challenge we have, but people love, and that's why I think we have 80 Australian members that paid $40 to $100, and all they get is a letter from me thanking them.
Yeah.
But I think
not even tax
people want to be a part of something doing something
Yes.
innovative. And so that's where it doesn't work, and it shouldn't work for all parks. I think one of the important lessons of the High Line is that, or one of the scary things for me is that the High Line becomes a model that every park should be privately supported. Or, of course mayors are going to love the High Line because private people will build it and maintain it. But, it works for in certain neighborhoods, in certain areas for very expensive projects. But ultimately, I think, the government and the public should be responsible for maintaining our public parks. So.
Indeed.
We have time for probably one or two more questions, depending on the gentleman here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Josh. I was interested in who currently owns the High Line, or what are the arrangements so that...
Yeah, so who owns the High Line? Yeah, so the city actually owns the structure, and then we have a license agreement as Friends of the High Line to manage and operate it. So we can't do whatever we want. I mean, I couldn't, build my apartment up there, sadly. So we work closely with the city, but I mean, one of the advantages of raising all the money is it gives us more control and more authority than we would have if we were just a private group that was paid for by the city.
Let's take these other questions. Gentlemen?
Robert, how do we convince developers, the council and state government that greening actually increases the value in high-rise areas?
Yeah.
I live in a high-rise area called South Bank, and I watch on a daily basis potential green areas being destroyed, and I see South Bank as tomorrow's vertical slum. How do we convince the developers that they have to take this green direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the, I mean, as you were just saying, it lowers crime, it increases health. I mean, the numbers are there. I mean, in every city. I mean, it was just like that very first study. Too often, I think parks groups and community groups just make the case for parks or greenery or, the pretty pictures. And what we did is we made the economic case. Because I'm sure it's true here, if you look at property values near parks, they go up. So, I think that's making the case. I mean, developers are never going to give you their land. So it's really a case, unfortunately, of the city having to buy it or finding properties, that are in city control and advocating for them being turned into green space.
Yeah, and look, the City of Melbourne knows, we know the value of open space. We just did our assets register, and the top 10 included most of our assets were parks. That's the most highly valued dollar for dollar in terms of our assets. I think the other thing too is that you just look at the City of Melbourne in terms of, we've got an open space strategy, we've got an urban forest strategy. So all these strategies are aimed at getting more open space, but I think the issue you've got is developers want to make money. And so we do have the 8% contribution for open space. That's a great start, but it certainly won't buy at market value, a huge open space like, a Fitzroy Gardens or Flagstaff Gardens. So we've got to be smarter about it. So we do things like we grab pocket parks where we can. So Errol Street, we were able to achieve a park which was about 15 times the size it originally was for under $2 million. Now on the market it would have cost us close to $15 million if we had to buy that space. So what we did is we actually grabbed back some of the road. Cars can still drive past there, people can still get around. But the interesting thing is, in this room we hear, we want more open space, we want green open spaces. And yet, when we actually proposed that park, there was quite a lot of residents and the school that were actually opposed to losing road space. So it's almost this constant battle that we're fighting all the time. But I'm pleased to say that in terms of open space, we've got far much more open space than New York has. So we do have a really good base to start from, but we've got to really think smart about how we can keep on, utilising these pocket parks, but then think about our rooftops, think about our walls, think about these sort of non-traditional spaces where we can increase the green infrastructure of our city.
Sure. Rob, I thought asking if you could speak briefly about the role of the the Design Trust for Public Space in New York, which seemed to be a very useful intermediary between what was a grassroots group and government early on. And just perhaps your thoughts on whether the High Line would have been built if not for September 11. I'm just wondering about the symbolic value of that and timing.
Yeah, so the Design Trust for Public Space is a great organization that looks at public space issues, and we applied for a grant which we got early on, and they paid for an early planning study that we did, I think it was in 2001 or 2002, that gave us a lot of early help. I think the second question was what was the role of 9/11, or what was the...
You talk about it briefly in your book, but just the symbolic value.
Yeah.
It sort of felt like for the city's psyche it was
very
so, timed.
I watched one of the towers fall from the roof of my apartment, and selfishly and embarrassingly, my first thought was, well, there goes the High Line, because who's going to care about the High Line now that this, the city's falling apart? But what was interesting is people cared more about the High Line. People they realized they couldn't, they're not going to be able to go rebuild ground zero. But here was something that was able to make the city better. So instead of, even though it was worse economic times, there were sort of bigger problems in the city, it actually galvanized support because people wanted to be a part of something positive, wanted to be part of something that was going to make New York better.
And Robert, what will the High Line look like in 2050?
Well, I think I calculated I'll be around 80. I'm 44 now. I'm not that good at math. So, I hope it's different. One of my fears is that it'll become too frozen. That they'll look back and try to preserve exactly how it is now. And, my dream is that they're doing completely different programming. I hope they're doing none of the things we're doing now. I just met with a person that is going to replace me, and I said, I'll be so disappointed if you keep doing all the stuff I was doing. It needs to keep changing.
Terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Robert Hammond, Councillor Arron and Professor Ruth Fincher.